Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this Bright Blue Ludgate Lecture. For those of you who don't know Bright Blue, we are an independent think tank that seeks to defend and improve liberal society. We work across four main research themes: economic policy, social policy, energy and environment policy, and most relevant to today's discussion, education policy, where we've had lots of success, particularly on the way that universities are financed and also the way that parents are subsidised for childcare support in changing government policy. And the Ludgate Lectures is a series of lectures where we invite very high-profile decision makers and opinion formers to give us their views on a very pressing and urgent topic. And we look to be informed, inspired, challenged by the lecturers that we have. And they are people from all sorts of backgrounds, political, professional, and social backgrounds. And today's Ludgate Lecture, and the Ludgate Lecture is named after our original headquarters in central London. And today's lecture is about closing the attainment gap post-pandemic. And in recent decades, we've seen significant improvements in standards and attainment in state schools in this country through a combination of reforms both to structures and to the curriculum, whether it's the introduction of the pupil premium, which directs more resources to children on free school meals, the wide adoption of phonics as a teaching method in early primary school, curriculum and assessment reforms, as well as widened academisation. And our performance in international league tables, for example, PISA, have improved, especially for maths. And before the pandemic, we saw the attainment gap, the attainment of rich and poor pupils closing. Of course, the pandemic came along and put a halt to that, reversing some of the gains. The learning loss that was endured as a result of the lockdowns and the increase in persistent absences, which has continued, is obviously having some very bad effects. And although there has been some improvement in overall attainment, we're still seeing that the attainment gap is wider than just before the pandemic. Now, Labour have come in, and the election means some changes to policy. For example, the removal of single headline Ofsted grades, increased capital investment in schools, which was announced in the recent budget, and a curriculum and assessment review, which is being led by Professor Becky Francis. So will these reforms help or hinder the closing of the attainment gap post-pandemic? And what more can and should be done to improve standards and attainment in English schools? I'm delighted that we have Professor Amanda Spielman with us today. She was previously the Chief Inspector for OFSTED, and before that, Chair of Ofqual. She's currently visiting Professor in Practice at the LSE Centre for Analysis of Risk and Regulation. And how we're going to structure the lecture today is that Amanda will speak for about 15-20 minutes. I'll then have a Q&A with her, and then we're going to open it up to questions from you. If you want to ask a question, please do so through the Slido link, which is just below the YouTube channel that you're watching. Please tell us who you are and what your question is, and they come to me, and then I'll be able to ask that question on your behalf to Amanda. And just to say, we obviously want to kind of have a wider audience than those just watching today. So if you're tweeting, please use the hashtag #BrightBlue or the Twitter handle that we use, #WeAreBrightBlue. So I'm going to pass on to Amanda. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ryan. And it's a pleasure to be here talking to you today. So you've asked me to talk about closing the attainment gap post-pandemic. So I thought I'd just start off by saying, what attainment gaps are we really talking about? There's a lot of different ways you can look at gaps. One is socioeconomic status. One is boys versus girls. One is on ethnicity. One is area-based. One is around special educational needs. Or you can just be looking at the spread of achievement itself, whatever the cause is. And I'm going to suggest today that we perhaps shouldn't simply default to thinking about socioeconomic status as the main or only driver. If we go to the latest PISA study, the 2022 round, and look at the analysis of equity there, which very much fits with the findings of previous rounds. This wasn't something new or surprising at that point. It actually, and they plot absolute levels of achievement against fairness, the sort of proportion of children's results that are accounted for by socioeconomic factors, on a 4-quadrant chart with countries that achieve highly and have high equity in the virtuous quadrant. At the other end, countries which have poor achievement and poor equity in the miserable quadrant, places like Panama, Mongolia, Romania sit down in that miserable quadrant. The levelling down, where the countries that achieve high equity but with very poor results, not a good place to be. So countries like Cambodia, Philippines, closer to the centre of the diagram, Greece, Turkey, those are all countries that sit in the levelling down box, that are sacrificing excellence for equity. Then you've got, but in the boxes with higher achievement, you've also got some countries which have got strong performance but lower equity, with higher than OECD average proportion of results accounted for by socioeconomic status. And that includes countries like Singapore, Switzerland, New Zealand, Belgium, Austria, France, and Germany. Circling back to the virtuous quadrant, that is where the UK sits in countries which are both high achieving and high equity. And other countries in Europe in that box are Netherlands, Sweden. They're both doing less well than Britain in terms of equity. Finland, Denmark, Spain, all sit slightly lower on the equity scale. So it doesn't mean that socioeconomic gaps aren't an issue in Britain, but it does suggest that it's not the first and most pressing problem that we should be concerned about in thinking about gaps. Again, if we look at ethnic achievement, for example, we can see that England specifically is one of the relatively few countries in the world where children from non-majority backgrounds on average do as well as the majority population. And that's been true for a number of years, and that there are very limited exceptions to that. Broadly, children from ethnic minority backgrounds do very well in English education. So there really isn't anything to suggest that a race or ethnic based approach to improvement would be a sensible and productive strand. But so if we take a step back and think about what happened in lockdown, we know we had unusually long school closures in England relative to the rest of the world, most of the rest of the world. All sorts of reasons for that I won't go into. We had quite unequal access to learning, especially in the first lockdown. And as we know from the difficulties with exams in 2020, it was really hard to attribute that to specific areas or specific schools, let alone specific children. We had a very substantial minority who didn't engage with online learning even when it was available. There were quite a lot of children who simply had no education for quite extended periods. And it wasn't just about having the technology and the tuition available. It's more complicated than that. We had delayed socialization. Children missed out on all the things that you learn from being with peers in a structured environment, with the expectations of school. And as Ofsted reported, children got lonely, bored, miserable, as well as doing less schoolwork. So in terms of how much academically was lost, children learning remotely, studies from various countries, I think, show that broadly they sort of typically learnt less than a third, not much more than a third of what they would normally have learnt in the same amount of teaching time. It was simply less efficient on average. Though there were exceptions, there were some children who learnt much more, but many more children who learned much less. Perhaps 20% of children who learned more, 40% who learned less. It was asymmetric. Those substantial losses were recorded. Many people wrote about them, but there has been considerable rebound. So some of the apparent loss was probably really just the decay of things that had already been learnt that needed practice and repetition to bring them back. And some of it was actually mislearning, but quite a lot of that does appear to have been caught up looking at the various strands of testing. There's a good blog on the No More Marking website describing the V-shaped recovery, showing the trends in their assessments that immediately after the first lockdown, there was a significant dip, but the accelerating trend line subsequently shows that it's probably not that, on the writing that they measure, it's probably not that far off where children would have been anyway, and may actually be there for most children. But there is this wider spread of achievement. There's no question about it. There are more low achieving children. And also, I will mention, because it's relevant to why it's been hard to do this, there are many more very unhappy children. So there are impediments to academic catch-up, and I'm going to run through some of them before I come on to the academic. Mental health and our approach as a society to mental health. First of all, lockdown itself, we know that anxiety, self-harm, eating disorders all increased significantly as a direct result. Our propensity to diagnose special educational needs and mental health problems has also increased quite significantly in recent years. The diagnostic threshold for autism has been lowered significantly. People are much more willing to look for and diagnose ADHD, other disorders as well. And with this growing volume, there are delays in diagnosis and treatment for those who do have clinical needs. And alongside that, I think we can see that parents are probably more willing to keep children out of school if they feel that their child's mental health will benefit from being excused some of that academic time. So on attendance, a phrase that I used, I think I was the first person to use several years ago, but that resonated and I saw go round and round and has been reused by many places, by many people. I talked about the broken social contract between families and schools, that parents were no longer feeling the same sense of responsibility to get their child to school every day, provided that the child wasn't really too ill to be at school. In return for schools plugging away on that long, slow business of education, where there aren't quick wins, where it's the accumulation, the consolidation of being there day after day, week after week, year after year, that generates the learning, the skills, all the good things that we want to come out of school. The delayed socialization, on attendance, I will say it's also not been a neat thing where you can say suddenly there are 2% of children who were attending perfectly before and now aren't going to school at all or hardly at all. It's across the board. Everybody's attending a bit less, which makes it a harder problem to address. You haven't got neat targets for intervention in the same way. But of course, unsurprisingly, the biggest deterioration has been for poorer children with special educational needs. Often children with significant health problems are attending a bit less. So there is no question for some of those children that they do have significant health problems that do affect school attendance, but nevertheless, that attendance has dropped. The delayed socialisation that affected so many children has increased the challenges of poor behaviour in many schools, and so sucks more staff time and capacity into teaching and managing behaviour. Budgets, of course, a constant pressure in the system. And it's worth actually saying here that system capacity is a problem even outside that. Even if money was less constrained, there'd be a finite supply of adults choosing to teach. I don't think we can assume that the teaching workforce is infinitely elastic. So this has made a tough platform for schools working to improve. And I stressed in my time at Ofsted, and I would repeat again now, that it's really important to recognise how hard it's been for schools with all these different things, with the learning backlog, with the attendance problems, with parents feeling a bit less responsibility to have their children at school, with the behaviour problems. It's not surprising that teaching and running schools has been a really hard job for the past 2 years. The main strategy that the government looked to help with catch up was tutoring. Certainly looked like the answer. There was a lot of encouraging research on tutoring. There's no doubt it can be effective. But it turns out that there are quite a lot of challenges in using it as a whole system solution. When you're using it at large scale for a lot of children, first, it needs a lot of good coordination between schools and tutors. There's no shortcuts. It actually needs to be integrated with the taught curriculum. Having a tutor who is randomly teaching some things that are completely different from what the child is getting in their main lessons is clearly potentially going to cause confusion, especially if it's being taught in different ways, or if the sequencing is out of whack. So it needs tutors with high skills, ideally qualified teachers, of whom, as I said, there's a finite supply. It needs spaces to do the tutoring in. You can't have a tutor sitting in the classroom with the child while the teacher's trying to teach a lesson. It needs time. If you've got a handful of tutors and 10 children for each of them to tutor, you've got to be able to make slots for all of those children. And if some of those slots need to be outside normal school hours, then you've got to get parent buy-in for having their school for longer hours. And you've also got to find staff who are willing to do overtime, paid or not. They still have to be willing to do those extra hours. So all of that at scale turns out to be quite challenging. I think there was also a bit of confusion about the purpose, whether this was about extra input for socioeconomically disadvantaged children, or whether it was about bringing the children who'd fallen sort of out of the range of normal classroom teaching within scope of their classroom lessons, so that so that all children could, as quickly as possible, get back to getting full benefit out of the main classroom. I did advise quite strongly that I thought that the latter was the better approach in terms of getting the education system back up to full effectiveness as fast as possible. But that wasn't the policy choice that was made, which was to focus much more heavily on disadvantage. So children who didn't happen to have a disadvantage label on them were less likely to get tutored, even if they were far adrift from the curriculum, than disadvantaged children who were much closer to where they ought to be in some cases. And here I'm also going to talk about the California class size experiment, and you'll see why in a moment. For those of you who don't know about it, some years ago, the powers that be in California wanted to turbocharge education in the state, and they looked around and decided that they really liked the research on reducing class sizes as a way to improve schools. And again, if you have a class and break it in half and bring in an extra equally competent teacher, you will get somewhat better performance, especially for younger children, actually. For older children and where behaviour is well managed, the difference is less than people think. But for the youngest children, certainly, you can see some benefits. So they decided essentially to halve class sizes across the entire very large state. The most expensive educational intervention ever, I think, because clearly halving the class size doubled the number of teachers. But it was a catastrophe. And it was a catastrophe because they hadn't taken into account that they would have to massively lower the bar to becoming a teacher. So for half the children in the state, or roughly, they were being taught by a lower quality teacher than they would previously have had, and sometimes very much lower. So the net effect of the whole thing, I can't remember whether it was negligible or even negative, but billions and billions and billions were spent for no benefit, for no educational benefit. And I'm not suggesting that tutoring was a catastrophe. It absolutely wasn't. Some really good work was done, but it did transpire that at scale, these problems that I just talked about scaling it up really did reveal themselves. And in practice, to get the quality and the coordination with the main curriculum that were needed, schools generally converged, in the main, they converged on one, using their own staff who understood their curriculum and were always around to interact and coordinate, and where they could be sure of the teaching quality. Two, there was very little appetite by staff or parents for out-of-hours tuition, so the capacity was essentially confined to what could be done within the teaching day. And three, tutoring tended quite quickly towards the sort of classical uses of helping children get better results in imminent tests. So it became less about filling in sort of general learning gaps and things that children should have learnt in lockdown and hadn't, filling in those sort of foundations of mathematics or whatever it might happen to be, and more about how we're going to get you a grade 4 in maths GCSE. Let's coach you in answering these types of questions, which may have some value to both the child and the school, but doesn't do so much to really fill the gaps in the way that the tutoring was originally envisaged as doing. And it's possible, though not by any means proven, that tutoring, that the attractions of tutoring, there's a lot to like about teaching a very small group of children, 2 or 3 children at a time, instead of a class of 25 or 30, especially when behaviour is challenging. So it may have begun to cannibalise the teaching workforce. Certainly, if it had been pursued at the scale that was originally contemplated, the sort of 15 billion that was talked about in the wake of the pandemic, I think that probably would have massively cannibalised the teaching workforce. So what has worked? Well, clearly you can't teach children who aren't at school. Restoring attendance is really important. And it's been a big policy focus now for several years. Secretaries of State have really thrown themselves into it. I did at Ofsted. Many people have been looking at this, working on this, trying to find ways to help schools. There just aren't shortcuts on this. Some schools are doing much better than others. And I think the reasons why some are doing so much better than others are a bit opaque. But there's no shortcuts. Plugging away, rebuilding that social contract, re-establishing those expectations, building cultures, building expectations does take time. We know that attendance sanctions have a mixed record. Attendance sanctions on parents have a mixed record, and they're particularly difficult where so much non-attendance is clearly linked to things like anxiety. doesn't put a parent-school relationship in a good place if a parent is saying, you're trying to force my child who is in tears and saying they're too anxious to attend, and you're saying we should be punished for not sending them. That's just not the kind of conversation that most schools want to get into. So the how do we reduce the child's anxiety is really important, but you can't just go straight to the stick and say that sanctions will solve it. And then in school, once you've got the children in school, first of all, a realism about children's starting points. Sometimes it's hard to acknowledge that children haven't learned as much as people hope they would through online learn, for example. But if they haven't, they haven't. Staff, schools need to suck it up and say, this is where they are and this is where we've got to teach from, because you do children no favours if you leave great jumps. The brighter ones may get over sort of gaps in what's been taught and sort of work out how to fill them in themselves, but the weaker ones won't, and you'll widen the gaps. The curriculum clarity. What's the content? What's the sequence? What's really essential in that sequence? And what are the things we've been doing that are nice to have, but if push comes to shove and we're making up for a lot of lost teaching time, what are the things that we can take out without damaging the longer term flow? And some of the feedback I've had was that the changes to the Ofsted framework in 2019 really had a lot of schools already thinking about their curriculum sequence and focus. And the schools that had really done a lot of work on that were in a better position to decide how to adapt than others. Efficient pedagogies, obviously. There are more effective and less effective ways of teaching. Direct instruction is often the fastest way of achieving a particular goal and the most reliable way of making sure that a whole group will get to mastery swiftly. Well-directed assessment that's really oriented not so much to predicting outcomes on GCSEs or other tests, but more to what have children mastered of the curriculum we've taught, what things need more practice, what things need reteaching to get that rapid and efficient loop back into what's taught. Well-directed additional support. Of course, every school has some children who need extra support, and making sure that is very well integrated and targeted at the children who are not in a position to get full benefit from mainstream teaching, to get them back into that position as quickly as possible, because then the school can run at full efficiency. Re-establishing school norms, getting the culture right, and with good behaviour management, but also good teaching of behaviour and routines, not assuming that every child has had everything they should have at home on that front, because some have and some haven't. But the right kind of teaching, not assuming that children should already know, teaching them what they don't already know on behaviour, again, is the fastest way to get to the kind of behaviour and culture a school needs. And all of these things actually are good education as we've long known it should work. And fortunately, when we were looking at this at Ofsted post-pandemic, it was clear that actually there was very good alignment with the inspection framework we'd brought in in 2019. So we didn't actually need to make any substantial adjustments. Of course, in terms of results, well, Ofsted wasn't given the GCSE results, for example, for the first 2 years after the pandemic because of the various sort of distortions of that were known about in teacher assessments. So inspection could not be looking for the same levels of results and shouldn't have been. But that getting to the essence of, is the curriculum sharp, clear, being carried through, schools tracking effectively and making sure that they loop back on the things that children need them to. All of that actually turned out to be very well directed to help schools to focus on the things that were most going to help schools and most going to help children. I've probably talked a little bit longer, Ryan. I'm sorry. I saw the clock ticking on, but I've finished what I wanted to say, and I think we've got time for quite a bit of discussion.
Great, thank you, Amanda. And it was no worries about going on longer because a lot of what you were saying was very informative. So thank you for that. And it gave me a greater understanding of some of the trends and some of the evidence base around what might work and what does work. I got a few questions before we open it up to the floor. So just a reminder to people, if you want to ask questions, you can do so through the Slido link just below the YouTube video that you're watching. So you mentioned, Amanda, about mental health and special education needs. And it sounded like you were being a bit skeptical that there was a kind of willingness to find and say that something was a mental health problem or was special education needs. And there was maybe a bit of concept creep going on, a kind of almost, some people have said there's a kind of over medicalization of everyday worries, and that's a problem. So do you take that view? Because others like Jonathan Haidt, for example, he's written this book, The Anxious Generation, thinks that actually the rise in internalizing mental health problems, anxiety, depression, is actually a real phenomenon. You look at self-harm and suicide rates, they've gone up, and he's sort of blaming social media for that. So perhaps I got you wrong there, but it just sounded like you were being a bit skeptical of the rise in mental health and SEN assessments, but maybe I was wrong about that.
No, I think you've slightly misunderstood. I was saying there's some of both. Clearly some of both. And I'm nice. For example, the diagnostic criteria in the sort of standard diagnostic manual, I think it's DSM-5, were widened a few years ago, effectively sort of significantly lowering the threshold for autism diagnosis. So levels that would once not have been diagnosed as autism now are. So that's greatly expanded. So changes like that in the sort of technicalities of diagnosis increase the numbers of children. But then there is the question of to what extent is their educational experience improved by tailoring to that. And certainly, if you talk to eminent clinical psychologists, talking about the range of children that they've been seeing post-pandemic, CAMHS practitioners will tell you that some of the children, they have to explain that they don't need a clinical diagnosis, and that what they are unhappy, they are distressed, but they are capable of functioning, and that broadly they're experiencing the lumps and bumps of adolescence. So I think it's in a world in which there is some genuine expansion of mental health problems, it's probably important for children's own benefit that we don't default too quickly and easily to that, not least because if you tell people repeatedly that they're mentally fragile, you probably make them more fragile. So one of the points that I'd actually like to make that is in talking about post-pandemic education, post-pandemic childhood, it's very important not to tell a story that discourages children from feeling optimistic about their own futures, from feeling that they can't achieve, or that there's something about them that makes it impossible for them to achieve. Children need that cycle of positivity to experience success, to experience the sort of burst of self-esteem that comes from getting something, from learning something, from acquiring a skill, that in turn creates the motivation to keep on working and working harder. By being sympathetic about mental health and talking a lot about mental health, we need to make sure that we don't accidentally make children unhappier and more pessimistic about their futures. So I have a big caveat on all of this, that notwithstanding the need to help an increasing number of individual children, we also need to make sure that it doesn't turn into a sort of national narrative of gloom and doom about children's prospects. Because the vast majority of children who have been unquestionably affected by the pandemic should nevertheless be capable of recovering and getting to sort of full functioning in adult life.
Okay, very clear, very nuanced, and I agree with that. Um, on phone-free schools, there's a sort of big push towards that. There's a kind of national campaign, and I'm just wondering how impactful you think the rise of smartphones and social media has been on children's learning. You know, Jonathan Haidt in his book talks about 1 in 5, I think, American girls spending, more than 25 hours a week on social media. It's almost like another job. So, do you worry about the impact, or do you think it's been overblown a bit? And do you think we should be moving to a situation where schools are completely free of phones altogether? All schools should have that.
I do worry about the impact. I mean, it's a massive change in children's lives. It's a massive reshaping of the experience of childhood and adolescence, which are so important for academic, social, emotional, all kinds of physical development. It's a huge disruptor, and it's only been with us. It's been with us for what, 10 years max. So we simply don't know about its impact across the whole of people's life courses yet. And we do have reasons to be concerned. At the first level, just about the sheer distraction of so many hours that are taken away from all the other kinds of activity that we know are part of developing and growing up. So, well, as Chief Inspector, I had to be very careful not to make policy prescriptions, but I have an enormous amount of sympathy with the schools that have decided that the only sensible way to manage this is to go phone free. I think the counter arguments that there's educational benefits to children in being able to use phones to research things and look things up, I think have pretty thin evidence to back them up. And there's a tremendous amount of evidence showing what an addictive technology it is and how hard it is once the phone is on your desk, not to look at it, not to be thinking about it, even if you're not actually reading it at a given moment. So I do think it's a rational and sensible thing. As things stand, it's for down to heads to decide. Some multi-academy trusts are deciding to make it a policy at trust level. But I think that will become a more popular approach. I think the schools that do it certainly see the social benefits. I'm not sure if there is solid evidence yet on the academic benefits, but I would be quite surprised if they don't materialise. But of course, I stand to be corrected on that. But what people tell me about simply the amount children start talking to each other again instead of sitting in playgrounds and common rooms, each in their own bubble. And we know that the loss of in-person interaction in the pandemic contributed greatly to children's loneliness and boredom and anxiety. And they had all the social media in the world. They could carry on chatting to each other on social media. They weren't deprived of that. If anything, they had more of it. But the in-person interaction is clearly profoundly important to social and emotional development for the vast majority of children. So reinstating some of what's getting lost at the moment feels to me like a good initiative.
In terms of I was struck by what you said in terms of the learning loss endured during the pandemic. That I think you said on average around a third of what a child was expected to learn in a year is what they got compared to if they weren't in lockdown. And I'm struck that there's also been this quite impressive bounce back, which is very encouraging in terms of, but those things don't sort of sit neatly for me. And I just want to interrogate it a little bit because I'm wondering whether learning loss is best captured or analysed, the scale of it and how you're reducing it is best analysed through assessments. because it strikes me that if we're saying that actually a lot of children have just caught up, but they've spent so little time in schools, that's an argument to say, well, actually, maybe they don't need to spend so much longer. They don't need to spend so much time in schools. If we know that we can speed up learning, as has happened, then maybe we don't need to have children in for as long a period of time. We don't need extended hours, for example, which a lot of people have campaigned for. So I don't know if you see the argument that I'm presenting.
Yeah.
And what your response to it, and correct me if I've got something wrong.
I think, first of all, I think there's not a massive correlation between the number of hours that children spend in school and their education, the national education success in Europe, though I think the highest achieving countries, especially in the Far East, tend to clock up much longer study hours per child than anywhere in Europe. I think what I have found most persuasive, I think I mentioned a No More Marking blog on the subject. It's to remind us that learning isn't something you do, tick that bit, learn the next bit, learn the next bit, learn the next bit. Learning is an accumulation of new inputs, nearly forgetting it, practice, retrieving it. It's a whole series of learnings and relearnings of the same thing and layering more and more on top. That apparent learning loss may have been more the disruption to that cycle of learning, forgetting, retrieving practice, that having broken that and had a lot of children doing no work or almost no work for several months, their test performance deteriorated, but they actually still knew a lot more than the test result at that point, when they were sort of unrefreshed, showed. So there has been, and there are also some elements. The maths has been slower to come back than English, and part of what's slow in English is simply vocabulary development now, and the ability to deploy sort of increasingly sophisticated vocabulary, grammatical structures. Some of that comes just from the use of oral language and from children's maturing and sophistication out of school, as well as in school. So I think the same test performed in the same circumstances, a good test, a well-designed test performed in the same circumstances, gives you strong information on a trend, because those early tests in the periods of lockdown and just after weren't in normal circumstances. So I think they exaggerated the trends as a result. But I think what we've seen are seeing and have seen is that most children are quite resilient, and that schools generally have responded pretty sensibly in how they've sequenced and prioritized. And I talked about sequencing and prioritizing and deciding what were the nice to haves. There are things that children in these catch-up years probably haven't had. They've probably had fewer school trips. They've probably had done fewer of the kinds of things that are fun experiences that make nice memories, but probably have less pedagogical value. If you've got to make tough choices, most schools, most teachers probably know what it makes sense to junk out of the teaching plans, at least for that year. And it's right that there should be a bit of space and flex in school curricula for those nice to have things. But when things are really tight, if it's a choice between a child doing well enough in maths to be able to do well in the GCSE course next year, or doing those nice to haves, you're probably right to prioritise the maths.
And then a final quick question from me, because I'm conscious of time and lots of people are asking questions, is just the correlation between spending and outcomes. Because it seems to me that the Labour government, do think that there is a relationship, hence, increasing capital expenditure in the budget, moving resources from the private sector through removing the VAT exemption on private school fees and shifting resources to the state schools. So how strong is that relationship between increased public spending and better outcomes in education?
International data says it's very weak, I think is the short answer to that. Again, I think there's an OECD analysis which shows an interesting chart, which I think shows roughly, I assume I'm on camera, that up to a certain level of school spending, there's a very clear and pretty much linear relationship between spending and results. And then it basically goes flat above that. And school spending in England is well into the flat zone. I think it's more than double the inflection point on those charts. So at one level, I think there's very weak evidence to suggest that there would be better results nationally if there were more money in the system. I think that the tension comes much more around actually children, lower achieving children, especially those who've been labelled as having special educational needs, because the expectations for what should be provided, how it should be provided, there isn't. The pressure is always to put more resource, more effort into that subset, and of course that in an overall, with resources constrained overall, that leaves less for others. I think it's a sensitive subject. It's extremely hard to get to an explicit view on what's the best distribution of education resource in a system. In England, unlike many countries, we really delegate that down to school level in the vast majority of cases. In multi-academy trusts, some of that may have been taken up, but by and large, we've allowed it to be a school level decision. And there's a lot to recommend keeping things as school level decisions by default. But in education, we have no equivalent of NICE, say, in terms of special educational needs, provisions and interventions. We simply don't really know where we get the greatest bang for our buck, and at what point we should probably say so far and no further. There's simply no basis for those kinds of conversations. So the experience in schools at the moment, unquestionably, is one of great pressure on resource. I think if you look internationally, I think schools in England are above average. I think they used to be, I think 15 years ago, I think they were one of the best, we were one of the best funded systems in Europe. I think there was a point, I think in 2010, only Norway and Luxembourg were better funded. I think schools in England are now significantly above the average, but not right out at the top. So it's hard to square that with the unquestioned experience on the ground of feeling very, very short of resource.
Very interesting. Thank you. Right. I'm going to ask some questions now from the audience. So I'll start with an MP. Lee Dillon, MP, has asked, for students with special educational needs, should schools allow them to drop some GCSE subjects to attend all other lessons? Is this a fair adjustment?
Many schools, I think, don't set a fixed number of GCSEs that everybody must do. I think there's normally a little bit of flex in the models for lower achieving children to do a slightly smaller curriculum than the most academic. And it's right that there should be some level of flex. And we in England we have flex in terms of the range of qualifications, and typically the less academic and those with special educational needs are more likely to do one or more BTECs or other non-GCSEs that may have slightly lower demand, in order to put together a program that fits them well. I mean, I would expect any good school to have a well-considered curriculum that does make sure that any given child has an educational program that is as demanding as they're reasonably capable of, but that doesn't put them in the position where they're bound to fail at what they're doing because they're overstretched.
Great, thank you. A question now from Beth, who asks, do you think there is a value mismatch between Ofsted, which is attainment-centred, and the wider teaching profession, which is more holistic?
Ofsted is not attainment-centred, full stop. This is a myth that goes round and round the system. You only have to look at the inspection framework to see how much of it is not around attainment. The framework that I put in, the quality of education, attainment is is a component of that, but only a component. There's a huge emphasis on the curriculum, on its implementation and the impact it's having. There's a big piece around behaviour and culture. There's a big piece around personal development. There's a big piece around leadership. It is a holistic approach. And yes, there is some correlation with attainment, as you would expect, between the value added as measured by tests, but it's far from a perfect correlation, because inspection does, and rightly, looks much more widely.
Okay. A question now from Margaret, who says, do you think the government adequately considered the impact on children when it closed schools during the pandemic? Do you think school closures were a mistake?
I think there wasn't, in that very first moment, I think there was an extremely high degree of uncertainty. And I think there probably was an assumption that children's lives could be put on hold, that we could press a pause button and press play a little bit later, and it would be as though simply pick up where we left off. We know that that wasn't the case. I know that I first started raising flags about the impact of children of continuing lockdown in April 2020. Through the rest of that year, I did that repeatedly, and the work that Ofsted did showing the loneliness, boredom, and anxiety was part of my rationale for saying these things, as well as the evidence of children not learning. And I did support reopening schools in December 2020, and took a lot of flack from unions from saying so. But I did that because it was clear that lockdown was harming children, and that in my view, the threshold for locking down schools needed to be higher than it was.
Great, thank you. And a question from Jamie, who says, phonics, maths mastery, and academisation were all evidence-based conservative reforms that improved education standards. Are Labour a threat to this progress?
So I think the position is a little bit more complicated for all of those. Moving the primary curriculum to fully phonic-based teaching was actually something that happened in iterations over time. And some of that happened pre-2010. Similarly, academisation was rooted in was rooted in the city technology colleges. It was an Andrew Adonis baby, the whole academisation programme pre 2010, and it was picked up and expanded. It's very rare. I mean, there's something about policies that it's unusual for there to be sort of total reversal of policy between administrations. So I do think that there have been real advances in curriculum and the impact on children from that over my time as first Chief Regulator at Ofqual and then Chief Inspector. So since 2011, I think a great deal has been achieved to be proud of. I think some of the academy chains have emerged as real powerhouses that are really focusing extremely well on the things that matter for children and helping their schools to be more than they could be individually, showing ways of moving beyond simply one school, one head, one governing body, every school in Ireland. I think they're showing us, demonstrating some really interesting ways of making a school system that really functions as a system, not just 20,000 flowers blooming. But of course, there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment. And I think what I think is very important for a new government is not to be different for the sake of being different. Again, I rebuilt inspection around evidence, around both in the round and within subjects, off a series of research reviews and a series of subject reports that we use to train inspectors in evidence-based conceptions of quality. This was not a framework that was built around the things I happen to like. This was a framework that was built around what does the evidence say about quality. So any departures, or the shifts, the iterations ought to be driven off the emerging base of evidence. And of course, new things will emerge that will suggest that this is done better this way, something else could be like that. And of course, there will be changes of policy emphasis. Some governments care more about one thing. There was a tension within the last government between, say, Nick Gibb, who was extremely focused on the sort of core academic results, and Robert Halfon, who really only cared about vocational education post-14 and wasn't convinced, I think, that anything else was necessary at that point. It's healthy to have some divergence. But it's important that those principles are made sufficiently explicit, and then that the how they're translated can be thoroughly evidence-based if we want the best for children.
And then the final question is from an anonymous person who has asked, if mental health is such a priority in schools, why is mental health and wellbeing provision not a distinct section in Ofsted reports?
It's because it is treated as part of the pastoral piece in inspection. It's not separated out because the pastoral work in schools has always encompassed the children who are struggling with anxiety or depression. But it's not right, in my view, that schools should become clinical institutions. To have a section in an inspection report on mental health would imply that teachers were meant to be therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, so practicing. And I think that's a line that shouldn't be crossed. Teachers are not trained mental health practitioners. The school's job, and that's already reflected in the framework, is liaising effectively with other services and being good at seeing signs that may be a problem and referring where appropriate, and responding sort of sympathetically and constructively, but nevertheless keeping their focus as schools.
And a final question from me, if I may, very briefly, which is, you talked very eloquently about how some of the very best evidence-based interventions take some time to emerge. So academization since the 90s and the CTCs, and then trialed in the noughties and then really expanded. And then the same with phonics as well. From your understanding of the evidence base now, do you think there are some kind of is there emerging evidence about particular interventions or styles of teaching where you think actually this could take off in the years ahead and become much more mainstreamed?
I think what we've seen over the last 10 or 15 years has been a real sort of growth in teacher interest in the evidential underpinnings of their own profession. And so, for example, the great interest in cognitive science and the applications in education, the use of cognitive load theory, for example, the evidence for that. I think there's a strong interest in understanding why and how, and in being able to use that knowledge to improve teaching, not just in inductive, instinctive ways. Well, I thought that worked better last year, so let's do a bit more of it and try again. To have people developing things on a sort of principle basis that if I make use of, for example, of this level of explicit teaching and then this kind of space practice and this other thing, I think there is a sort of an intentional sort of more curriculum design skill and more pedagogical skill sort of developing in the system off the back of this. And there's a wave of really interesting education publishing off the back of it, and a lot of sort of teacher-to-teacher events where teachers are discussing the things they've been reading, the things they're developing, the things they're trying. I hesitate to name names, but I can think of, for example, of a primary teacher, Christopher Such, who's done some wonderful work and been really influential. And that's very much around peer sharing. He's been very generous with sharing his work. So I really welcome that intellectual revitalization of teaching. And I think it's helping people also remind people that there are a lot of different skills. I mean, it's perhaps easier for us to see in, say, running an airline, that you need a lot of different things. It's not just all about have you been a pilot. It's there are people who can design planes, who can build them, who can maintain them, who can navigate them, who've been trained to be the people holding them if they're in danger of crashing. You need all of those. And in the same way, there are a lot of different skills that go into running a really good school, and some around curriculum, some around pedagogical expertise, some around assessment, some around behavior management, some around the difficult end of pastoral work. Nobody is going to be a total expert in all of them simultaneously. I think it's really healthy and valuable to recognize that they're all important strands of expertise, and that a school needs a mix of people and the mutual respect between people to know what they don't know and to value those of their colleagues who do, and to adopt sort of school-wide systems that enable schools to draw in the best way and most efficiently on all the expertise that needs to add up to a really good sort of education establishment.
Thank you, Amanda. That was very interesting. And we could probably go on all day talking, but the school bell is going literally because I have to pick up my child very soon. So I have to set off for that. But that was a really informative and impressive lecture. So we're very grateful for your time. And I probably speak on behalf of the rest of the audience, which I really hope that you continue to kind of contribute and influence education policy in this country. So thank you to everybody who is watching today. Just to say, the next Ludgate lecture is with Anthony Selden in early December, where he'll be talking about what makes a good Prime Minister. So that will be very interesting. So please tune in for that. But a final thank you, a virtual round of applause to Amanda Spielman. We're very grateful for your time and thoughts. Have a good afternoon